Throughout the 100 years of radio broadcasting in Canada, there have been many aspects and components that have shaped the landscape of radio that we are familiar with today. Over the decades, radio has seen many changes in music, personalities, and formats, all things we hear on the air and also the aspects and components that have been documented extensively in broadcasting history, academia, and other such materials. Another aspect and component that we do hear when listening to the radio is being provided with information, a thing we call the news. How did news make its way onto the airwaves, and what significant role has news played in Canada's radio history? I'm Scott Brooks, and these are the things that we'll be analyzing as I take you through the Sounds of Radio, a history of news reporting in Canada. Canada's and the world's first commercial radio station, XWA of Montreal, received the first broadcast license on December 1st, 1919, and the first scheduled broadcast was in May of 1920, predating KDKA of Pittsburgh's first broadcast by 6 months. This would make XWA, later known as CFCF, the oldest radio station in the world. Following this milestone, the 1920s saw an explosion of interest in the novelty called radio. Radio news veteran and professor Paul Cross says news was not originally part of radio and newspapers feared this new medium.
Didn't do any news. And wasn't supposed to do any news, and of course the newspapers were desperately afraid of radio and did everything they could to prevent radio from broadcasting news, unless it was a radio station that was owned by a newspaper.
Besides fear of this medium, some major newspapers across Canada were applying for licenses, but for different reasons. According to Bill McNeil's book, Signing On, some newspapers saw radio as an opportunity for advertising dollars, while some even saw radio as a valuable promotional tool. Despite all the journalistic presence, news content on Canadian radio was minimal in the 20s. Newscasting evolved slowly as a distinct feature of radio in Canada. Newscast, usually during the day at 8 in the morning, 12:30, and 6 at night, began to be heard in the late 20s and early 30s on a few larger stations, with their content still lifted, sometimes with permission but often without, from the pages of local newspapers or from a leased wire service. Canada's first documented personality newscaster was Vancouver province reporter Earl Kelly on CKCD, starting in the early 20s. Over a period of 20 years, his nightly 15-minute summaries were eventually heard on several Vancouver stations, with his magazine containing as many as 90 items. By the mid-1930s, the importance of news as a vital component of broadcast schedules was no longer in doubt, with the prominence of newspapers starting to fall and radio beginning to rise as a source for immediate news. By the mid-1930s, the importance of news as a vital component of broadcast schedules was no longer in doubt, with the prominence of newspapers starting to fall and radio beginning to rise as a source for immediate news. An example of immediacy in news reporting was in April of 1936 when a CBC news reporter by the name of J. Frank Willis was on the scene of a Nova Scotia mine disaster, broadcasting 5-minute bulletins every half hour for the next 111 hours, further marking the importance of news on the radio.
And that was one of those cases that showed you can do real-time live coverage of something that people are interested in.
At the time, Willis's reports were carried by every one of Canada's 58 radio stations and some 650 stations across the United States. This immediacy and coverage of the mine disaster is something that could have not been done through print. Also during this time, some tailored-for-radio newswire services began to appear, further diminishing the reliance on newspapers as a source. From there, the importance and the necessity of radio news reporting was realized, and it began to greatly expand. By the 1940s, during World War II, through newswire services, it was radio that could bring Canadian listeners the actual sounds of the battlefield and provide up-to-date developments on the war as it progressed. News broadcasts became more frequent during the war, and to feed radio's galloping appetite for more news, the Canadian Press, in 1941, formed a custom service for radio called Press News, later being retitled to the more suitable name of Broadcast News. It was also during the war when radio news reporting saw many advancements being made, such as the development of the wire recorder and the walkie-talkie two-way radio. The development of these inventions liberated radio news from the newsroom, allowing news reporters to be able to go on location and report the news as it happened. But by the end of the decade, radio news reporting was at a new crossroads with the dawn of television. The purveyors of doom and gloom predicted that radio would be destroyed by the arrival of television. In fact, if the 40s were the golden age of radio for variety and drama, radio news in Canada came of age in the 50s. By the mid-50s, radio news flourished, propelled forward by the challenge posed by television news. Radio continued to lead the way in news coverage as reporting could be done virtually anywhere and at any time without the setup of huge equipment that TV required when out on the field. Because of the introduction of TV, radio news remained competitive as it continuously looked at ways of adapting new technologies and techniques to bring news faster to the listener. By the 1960s, some radio news reporters even had mobile offices in cars or trucks that were miniature reproductions of studios equipped with mobile telephones, shortwave radios, tape recorders for recording and editing, and a place in which to write and broadcast reports. And if a news reporter did not have a way to send their physical tape recordings back in time to the station, they could go to a payphone and unscrew the telephone mouthpiece to hook up their tape recorder in order to deliver an interview or report, which then could be used in broadcast. The payphone technique also was a way to enhance the sound of the transmitted report, bypassing the lower quality telephone mouthpiece and substituting a broadcast microphone in its place. The technology of tape recording eventually saw great improvements with the introduction of reel-to-reel recorders that could withstand the Canadian climate, as earlier recorders would refuse to function in colder temperatures. Then, by the 1980s, the bulky and heavy reel-to-reel recorders were phased out with the introduction of the cassette recorder, which made recording on the scene even easier as it was more portable and lighter to carry. It wasn't just out in the field that saw changes in news reporting. The newsrooms also saw advancements in technology. By the 1990s, there was the introduction of computers and the internet, replacing the need to have typewriters and paper news wires. Now, news broadcasters had the information they needed just a click away. The introduction of a computer also led the way for better audio editing, completely erasing the need for tape. One of the many broadcasters to witness this change of technology in the newsroom was radio news reporter Andrew Dawson.
When I started in Port Alberta in 1990, I had a manual, not an electric, a manual typewriter, just like good old Clark Kent in the old Superman. Manual typewriter, 2 sheets of yellow canary paper, and a piece of carbon paper in between, so you'd make 2 copies. That's how I started in the business. We had paper files, we had filing cabinets, you had to keep every story, you had to cross-reference every story, and some places were good at keeping their paper records, and others just weren't. And one place that was great was again News 1130. But by then now, the internet had started. We were writing scripts on word processors. You could write the script at your workstation and then go into the studio, and that same script would be on your screen. You wouldn't have to punch a bunch of things or print a bunch of things or whatever.
Dawson also noted the quick turnaround of technology and how it was eventually consolidated into one device.
From there, though, it just made our lives so much easier. And it was so funny because, I mean, I went from 4 years previous to running around having a reel-to-reel or a cassette recorder, microphone, notebook, all these files you would carry with you and all that stuff. And within a few years, everything was on my phone. All that stuff, everything that I was carrying around was on my phone in my hand. And that was only a 10-year, maybe 15-year stretch.
While the technology has changed, according to Paul Cross, the overall practice of news reporting has not.
You're still taking the same steps of information, verification of information, writing it for radio, and delivering it over the radio. The news gathering and news production process are not different. The tools you use are different, but the process is essentially the same.
Along with the changes in technology, Canadian radio news also began to change with the introduction of a radio station purely dedicated to news itself. During the 80s, the popularity of contemporary music on the AM band started to diminish as FM took hold of the market with higher sound quality. In order to adjust to that change, on the morning of June 7, 1993, at 6 o'clock, Rogers Radio made the flip from music on CFTR in Toronto to 680 News, Canada's first all-news radio station. The first voice to be heard on the inaugural newscast on 680 News was with radio news veteran Dick Smythe.
This is 680 News.
Good morning. It's 14 degrees at 6 o'clock on this Monday, June the 7th. I'm Dick Smythe, and here's what's happening. There will be normal GO Transit service this morning. Service on the weekend was normal as well. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, 1 week left in power, said farewell at Baie-Comeau, Quebec last night. Canada's first all-news radio station is on the air. All news, all the time. After a Sunday of meetings, Premier Bob Rae says that his goal remains the same, to trim 2...
With the Toronto station's success, Rogers later expanded the format to its other AM stations across the country. Eventually, other companies would make similar changes to their AM stations with the flip to a news format. The flip to an all-news format would further make news available to the listener at all times, no longer relying on news at fixed times. Rogers also made Canadian radio history by launching the first all-news FM station in 2005 with News 95.7 in Halifax, which also follows a similar formula to 680 News. It was also by this time that news could be read and heard online, a practice that is still in use to this day to be available to the listener at all times, even when out of range of the broadcast area. Now that we've looked a bit at the evolution of news on the radio, I will take you through some of the other points of interest of news reporting in Canada. I had the privilege to talk with radio news veteran and commentator Dick Smythe about his career and how he got interested in radio.
Born and raised in Montreal, and I don't know, I used to listen to CJAD, CFCF, and of course those are the days of the radio dramas and so forth. I just kind of got fascinated by the medium, I think. Got interested in it. I don't think my family was keen about me going into a business like that. I think my father saw me, ending up as a office worker somewhere. But I just got fascinated by the business.
Smythe's first paying job in radio was in Cornwall in 1954, and then eventually he would make his way to doing news at the legendary CKLW in Windsor. One of the major stories Smythe got to report on during his time at CKLW was the Detroit riot of 1967.
The big one, I think, was covering the Detroit riot. I lived with that story for a week. We won the International RTNDA award for that. That's probably the biggest story.
It was also during his time in Windsor where he got started with his famous news commentary.
I just started actually on CKLW FM doing a commentary. Eventually, I don't actually remember if I did it on air on the CKLW AM or not, but in any case, I moved to Toronto. I started doing commentary, and things worked out well,
Following his 13-year stay at CKLW in the summer of 1969, Smythe would make his move to become news director at 1050 Chum in Toronto.
In
In Toronto, it's 4 o'clock. This is Dick Smythe. Chum Contemporary News for Carling's Breweries. Ontario Provincial Police have increased patrols in urban and rural areas of York County to ease the tension of residents concerned by the murder rapes of last month. The OPP says the patrols will continue until the suspect is arrested. Meantime, the 27-man investigative team working on the case has asked the public for assistance in their work. Police have checked out registration of thousands of Rambler vehicles and have thousands more to check.
It was in Toronto where Smythe would work at Chum, further developing his portfolio and eventually making his way in 1987 to CFTR, which would become 680 News, as mentioned earlier in this program. Now getting back to Smythe's departure in Windsor, CKLW's 2020 news coverage would take an interesting twist when a young Gary Mack, better known as Byron McGregor, would become head of the news department. The style of presenting the news that McGregor brought to CKLW became infamous and was seen as an edgy way of providing entertainment while still delivering the news. This practice was far from traditional.
A barroom blow-up on Detroit's southwest side early today. 3 gun-toting men walked into the Highlight Bar in the 7000 block of West Fort and began blasting away at everything in sight. 2 men were killed, blown right off their chairs. They've been identified as 31-year-old Joe Battle and 64-year-old Bonders Henderson. The trio left just as quickly as they arrived, and police are still looking for them.
Others at CKLW to have adopted McGregor's style were also the likes of Grant Hudson and Lee Marshall.
Another deadly duo of Detroit dastardly deeds as the dice decreed death. A disagreement over 7-11. Now she's in heaven. The man who delivered that double-barreled death with his package of penetrating pellets has been pounced in the pen. In another case of hot lead in the head, a heavy-handed hitchhiker tipped with a trigger and paid his bill in bullets. More violence on Cyprus as the U.S. ambassador is shot and killed.
It's 20 minutes before 5. This is Lee Marshall, CKLW 2020 News. An unidentified young boy was riding his bike on Van Dyke near Lance this afternoon when a steel truck collided with that boy, knocking him about 20 feet. Eyewitness James Mays was there. He called the law, then called the Big 8 to say it was enough to make you sick.
In retrospect, while this was not the most traditional style of news to be using, it definitely did leave its mark in Canadian radio news reporting. Now, as for getting started, not all news reporters began in news. In fact, some like Paul Cross started as jocks.
I guess for about a year. And I was doing a Sunday morning show one day, and I remember it vividly. A sales guy came in and sat down in the control room. I was like, "Hey, how are you doing? What are you doing here today?" "Oh, I just thought I'd drop in and say hello," or whatever. And he said, "Paul, there's an opening in the newsroom." I said, "Yeah, I see that." And he said, are you going to apply for it? I said, no, I don't think so. That'd be a waste of my talent. I want to be a jock. I want to spin the tunes and play the music and stuff. And I remember this vividly. He looked at me and he said, "Paul, you do a better newscast than anybody in the newsroom." So this appealed to my ego quite nicely, and I applied for it, and I got it, and I'm really happy I did, because my entire career, I think, took off from that moment of realizing, you know what, I can do this. And the thing is, it's not that I was disinterested in the news. I always followed the news. I mean, I remember being a little kid looking at the paper and always listening to the news on the radio and always watching the news at night. Like, it was just, you weren't with it. If you didn't know it was in the news, what am I going to talk to you about? You don't know what's happening in the world, kind of thing. So I was always aware, but it wasn't that I ever wanted to work in news. I wanted to work on the radio, and it's not news I wanted to do. But because I did, I realized every day when I go to work is different. I don't know what I'm going to cover today. I don't know what's going to happen in the news today that wasn't already in progress. And I'm really glad that happened.
Because Cross transitioned over to the world of radio news, he would get to be part of reporting and sharing stories, especially once he made his way to 1050 Chum, where he would produce mosaics or news features on major timely issues, such as the AIDS crisis.
The big one was a documentary I did on AIDS. It was to be the story of AIDS in Canada, and the boss pitched it to me at a party. And I said, "Why me?" And he said, "Because I think you would do it." I thought about that, and eventually I did it. It ended up being called Fighting Chaos and Apathy, the story of AIDS in Canada.
Another major news story to be covered on the radio in more modern times was the day the World Trade Center was attacked, 9/11. Even though the attack happened in the eastern part of the continent, it still had a major effect on air travel everywhere within North America, including Vancouver, where Andrew Dawson was reporting on the radio that fateful day.
On that morning, I saw the report that a plane, a private plane, had smashed into one of the towers. And not long before, a baseball player had crashed his plane in New York very similarly. And so that's the first thing I thought of was, oh, God, some, Johnny Rich dude out playing with his toy flew it in the Trade Center. So I go in the shower and I get ready and I come out, and then I see that it was a commercial plane, a flight that had hit the World Trade Center. I'm like, well, how the hell? That couldn't have happened by accident. And before I even finished that thought in my head, I'd already picked up my gear, threw it into my news car, I had my own news car, and started driving to the airport without even being told. And partway there, back in those days, you could talk on your cell phone and drive. And I called, and the office says, "We need you at the airport." And I said, "I'm already halfway there." And that's where I spent days and days.
Tim Kacharik also shares his experience of 9/11 as a news reporter while working in Penticton.
Of course, 9/11 was on the air that day. There was a 3-person newsroom, and I'm sure whoever was on the air that day has some, I don't use this term lightly, but amazing stories of what just went on that day. And there was literally, I was anchoring both the FM, AM, and even for the More Music FM side, I was doing recorded updates every half an hour and live updates on the AM side every half hour. And we were reading from paper and had digital clips, but I would literally just run into the table, grab stories, build casts on the fly, and the other two reporters were just gathering wire copy and phoning around and talking to churches, talking to mayors and that type of thing to kind of get the reaction of the day. And that was ended up being the longest newscast of my career, still at 11 minutes on that day at 5 o'clock. And I know we all still, that day is ingrained in our brains, but for being on air and kind of reading and not knowing and not believing the words that are coming out of your mouth, it was surreal, and looking back, it still is. I was like, wow, I can't believe what I was saying.
News reporting on the radio continues to be there, providing updates on major crises that affect or are important to the listener. A prime example of a recent crisis that radio news is covering is the COVID-19 pandemic. In a previous documentary, The Sounds of Radio, How Radio Responded to the COVID-19 Pandemic, I looked at how radio was providing information to the listener during the initial stages of the pandemic. Radio newscasts, whether local or national, made every effort to include pandemic-related news as a top story.
From the National Newsroom of the Canadian Press, I'm Jerry Smith. A new survey suggests more than half of Canadians polled are finding it stressful to be out in public with the restrictions to prevent the spread of COVID-19.
Alberta sees another COVID-19 related death. Health Canada says it has authorized the first use of COVID-19 blood tests in Canada.
Even during the seriousness of the pandemic, there were even lighthearted news stories to be shared, such as this one from 680 News Toronto's Kevin Meisner.
Staying at home during lockdown is giving us a lot of extra time. Some people are learning a musical instrument, taking up a hobby. A Pickering woman and her daughter are dressing up as dinosaurs to give away handmade masks.
This all started when Demi Antonakis and her mom Nina started making reusable masks for shelters and nonprofit groups.
Then we figured while we were at it, we might as well distribute some to our neighbors, and my mom thought to do it in the dino suits.
Nina says the reaction as they wobble around Yonge Dundas Square and elsewhere has been overwhelmingly positive.
The biggest response actually, that we've gotten. It isn't thank you for the masks so much as the thank you for doing this and giving me something to smile about today.
So far, they've given away 300 masks, but what's life like inside that suit?
It is very hard to walk and very hard to see in those suits, but it's so worth it.
Instagram videos of the pair in costume have received attention from 16 countries around the world. Groups who would like the masks can send an email to dinomaskmakers@gmail.com. In Pickering, I'm Kevin Meisner.
According to Casey Kenny, a news reporter in Stratford, out of his over 10-year career, the COVID-19 pandemic is the biggest news story he has covered to date and possibly the largest in his career.
You know, what's the biggest story or sort of that I've covered? And I have to say, as recent as it is, it's been COVID-19. It's been just the changes and being in a pandemic and you know, for a while having to work from home and write stories and cover things from home, and then, you know, being back at the station and reporting and anchoring on that, and just the changes every week and just the impact that it's had. I don't think there's a corner of this world that it hasn't impacted, you know, and it's just been such a massive story, and it's been a changing story, and it's been one that I've never covered anything like this. You know, I was mentioning to you before we did the interview, 2 to 3 media conferences a week online on Zoom. Before this even started, I've never heard of Zoom before, you know. So, I mean, that's something in itself. But, you know, just to be covering this all the time, be covering daily numbers, both provincially and locally and nationally as well. It's been a story that I can't compare anything else to. Certainly. I mean, I've covered a lot of different stories over the years, you know, but there's been nothing that compares to COVID-19 in the impact that it's had.
As for the significance of radio news reporting, Paul Cross believes that it is extremely important and one part of radio that will continue to serve the need as a trusted source for information.
Well, I think it's really important. And I think it's really important that people get reliable information from reliable sources of information. I think most radio stations are known to be reliable sources. Many radio stations in cities all over Canada have been there for a long time. They're a known and trusted source. Anybody can start up a news organization today, sure, and use whatever platform they want, because it's only radio and television that are regulated. Newspapers aren't regulated. Nothing on social media is regulated. It's subject to law, but it's not subject to regulations such as radio and TV. It's not licensed. Those are the only ones that are licensed. And I think there's a great responsibility that comes with the license and a great tradition of service and responsible coverage. And I think people will always need information. We always need news. I really regret, I fear, for the number of people who do not get news from reliable sources.
Regardless of the changes and challenges that radio and news reporting has faced over the past century, it will be interesting to see what the next 100 years holds for news reporting on the radio, despite the challenges that may lie ahead. And hopefully, radio news will be there for you, continuing to provide news as a trusted source for years to come. Special thanks for contributions to the Sounds of Radio, a history of news reporting in Canada, goes to Airchecker on Twitter for promotion of this project, 100.1 Moose FM, Fort St. John, for the use of facilities and production equipment, Hudson Mack for history on his brother Byron McGregor, Charlie O'Brien, CKLW historian, for the airchecks of Byron McGregor, Dale Patterson of rockradioscrapbook.ca for the use of historical air checks, Doug Thompson of the Chum Archives for the use of Chum air checks, and broadcastinghistory.ca for historical resources and information on the history of radio news reporting. For the Sounds of Radio, a history of news reporting in Canada, I'm Scott Brooks.